Uh, so Buddhism is not nihilism. There is purposelessness in within Buddhism, but it's not necessarily meaninglessness. It's not that nothing, that there's no rhyme or rhythm to anything. Could we maybe get into what then Buddhism is? I believe that one of the main points that you start off with in the chapter is you describe it as being the journey for truth. What is that?
Yeah, yeah. So, like you were pointing out, not just the issue, this being an issue with Harari writing a book, but it should tip us off that there's a religion that's existed for what, 2,600 some odd years at least. It's probably not nihilism. Like it's probably not based on a self-defeating purpose. There's probably a reason why it's propagated. So that should just be a red flag from the beginning. And there is this paradox of purposelessness, which can convince us, if we're of the modern Western mind, to run with that and go down the line to meaninglessness. This is a paradox. It's something difficult, and it's a big part of the chapter. So we'll get to how those can coexist in a little bit. Yeah. So the search for truth is inherent in Buddhism as it is in all things, and this belies the idea of meaninglessness. I mean, the story of the Buddha is an inspiring story. This is a guy who was born into the world and pampered and raised with everything he could want, and yet through exposure to the deficiencies in the world, he inevitably noticed, even though it was people tried to hide it from him, that there's death in the world, there's sickness, there's disease, there's these things that perfect that bothered him, and then he dedicated his life to finding perfection, essentially, of figuring out how things could be okay in a world of disease and decay and torment and all that sort of stuff. So, and he gave up everything to do that. And he went through amazing trials, and he dedicated himself to severe asceticism for a while. He lived a life of indulgence, and he ultimately rejected both of those. And so there's in this story that appeal to people. It's ultimately a story of a search, and there's really common elements of human experience on sort of all sides throughout it. So that as a whole already is a purposeful story about a guy who sought truth. So to Buddhism, they are seeking, and they believe that this person, the Buddha, was someone is seeking the same thing, or was seeking the same thing that they are seeking, and that he did it well. So these are all purposes. This is all meaning. This is about truth. Now, that someone might object to that and be like, well, yes, that's because you're telling a story about the Buddha. But if you sort of reject all that and you just focus on just the philosophy, then you realize that Buddhism is about meaninglessness. And that's also just blatantly not true. The the core of Buddhism, the literal core of Buddhism, is the Four Noble Truths. So truths in all capitals there, four true over other things. And then there is the Four Noble Truths lead to, in an ordered way, in a way of logical understanding, again, with meaning, purpose, and truth, to eight the eightfold path. I don't know why my brain's messing that up now. Noble eightfold path.
Could
And
you
these
repeat
are
that?
eight
Could you repeat
things
that one more time?
that you're supposed to structure your life around. And
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? It was
which one?
the eightfold path.
Yeah, the noble eightfold path.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So these are things that you're supposed to structure your life around, these are particular ways that you're supposed to act and or strive after acting. So, and included within the Noble Eightfold Path is things like right belief, right effort, right intention. These are all things that are clearly purposeful. These are clearly meaningful. These are clearly driven towards a certain end. They exclude other things. So this is, I mean, this is the core of Buddhism. So to say that that's nihilistic is just nonsense. I mean, you have to accept a discipline. You have to order your mind in a certain way. You have to examine things logically and in a sequence, and you have to discern what's there and what's not. You have to reject some insights, even some states. In fact, in some Buddhists might say all spiritual states. Um, so, so the idea that it's about meaninglessness as a whole is just utter nonsense. It's saturated with meaning, and that's inescapable as the rest of life is.
Right. Absolutely. That's again, that's just something that is so easy to assume, you would have to delve a little deeper into the literary works of the religion to discover the Eightfold Path and to see the what was it called? The law of dependent origination, which is something that I think that we'd like to touch on as well. But there's structure, there's meaning, there's a path within the religion. Like you mentioned, if it was all nihilistic, the religion wouldn't have been able to exist for as long as it has, because there has to be that level of progression or at least stability throughout
I think
time.
that'd be a good opportunity then now to discuss what that true meaning of purposelessness is within Buddhism. What,
Right.
what were you referring to then at the beginning of our talk?
Yeah. So for the most part, meaning is synonymous with purpose. And so to say that the world is purposeless would normally be to say that the world is meaningless. Now, as we've looked at, Buddhism depends on meaning, but then okay, maybe it's self-contradicting. Maybe it is this self-defeating system, and for whatever reason has just worked and people haven't noticed it. But I think that there's something else going on. And actually, I quote David Benatar because he actually has this insight in the same way that I've had it. And it's, I mean, it's respectable that he could figure it out. So he says, God would not worry about whether he was fulfilling some external purpose. The whole project of transcendence only makes sense if one is limited. It would be incoherent to want to transcend a limit that you did not have. So he's saying God is unlimited, so he wouldn't have an external purpose. So this, I think, is the key to understanding it. Odd enough that it comes from Benatar, but purposelessness in Buddhism is connected with nirvana. It's connected with infinite peace. And that is a different thing than explicitly in Buddhism, they say nirvana is not annihilation. So it's not about annihilation, it's not about nihilism. And as much anytime you give a positive description of it, there's an issue, but it's essentially infinite peace. And so the language of purposelessness is about, I think, the perception of God's perfection. The fact that God is whole, infinite, and perfect necessarily means that his action, his point of view, though that's sort of gets you into trouble, but God's perspective is purposeless. Not that it's indifferent, not that it is callous, not that it is uncaring, but it does not seek something outside itself. It does not have a greater purpose to move towards. There's a quote, I think it's from Ignatius of Loyola, who describes God as like the truest description of God is love loving. God is already love, and what he does is love. He is loving. So he's not seeking something else. He's just exuding himself. He's just being himself. And therefore, there's a certain way of thinking about that that says that's purposeless. That's not a dim view. That's not a cynical view. It's not a view that says life is meaningless. It's a view that says, wow, it's perfect. And because it's perfect, therefore it's purposeless. So it's this view of infinity, and it's a view of seeing and joining with infinity that brings about what can be called purposeless. It has, but that's a disconnect and a separate issue than looking at us individually and saying our lives are purposeless and therefore meaningless. Because on this level, we do have things that are beyond us. We do have things to seek. We are here for a reason. Things happen in a sequenced, patterned way. There is purpose. So life, creation as a whole, is purposeful. It is full of purpose. And God has created it with infinite purpose, actually. But God himself is not subject to purpose because God has nothing to seek, nothing to gain. Purpose is about seeking and gaining. So that distinction, I think, is what is going on. And Buddhism is talking about nirvana, is talking about infinite peace. And this state is the state of purposelessness, which is the same thing as God's perfection.
I think of, if God is all that is, all that is doesn't need to be anything else than it already is.
Right, exactly.
There's no desire to be anything outside of himself. Even when you described God is love and God is loving, you could say, well, God's purpose then is to love. But I mean, that in and of itself, I guess, would be an accurate statement out, if you were to compare it to, for a lack of a better term, a book's purpose this is to be a book, and so this book is being a book. So God is love and he is loving. Therefore, God is just existing. So the purpose is then existence. But outside of that, it's I see what you're saying, the infinite doesn't need to be anything outside of itself. So the idea of purposelessness within Buddhism, from my understanding, is that is the way to get closer to God, is through identifying with that purposelessness, not necessarily on an intrinsic level with your own specific life path, but that is the way of identifying with the infinite, with God. I do want to talk about the connection, then kind of wrapping it up, the connection with Christianity, because I know we were looking at, coming into the chapter, there was that preconception of looking at Buddhism or Eastern thought, as Harari would, as making a connection with nihilism, but that clearly isn't the case. So we can make a connection with Christianity as being, not only can we look at it from a level of causality, because both adhere to causality, but then there's also that overarching meaning. And then, even although we've just discussed purposelessness within Buddhism, I think that just by having that level of meaning, inherently there's there's purpose that can be derived from that.
Yeah. So I think that part of the problem is the common phrase of like Buddhism is a philosophy, not a religion. It's just like, I mean, to modern Western philosophers who just read the text like it's philosophy, then yeah, sure. But Buddhism is a religion. It has different social castes that it prescribes, and it talks about how they're supposed to interact with each other, and it tells you how to dress, and it tells you fables and all this stuff. And for the vast majority of uh, several millennia, it has functioned as a religion. And I think it's pretty obvious once you return to that. So if you think about like I was talking about, the practice of monks that go around every day begging at their towns, they also have a sort of, you might call it like a mission, so not exactly the same, obviously, but where they essentially go on a very long alms trip where they take nothing with them and just go walking, and they have a particular either amount of time or amount of distance that they're supposed to go. And it's like, if you're in the United States, it's like you're walking across multiple states. And then at that point, you're just dependent on being cared for by other people. You have no community that knows you. You're just dependent on the goodwill of others. And so I like just thinking about someone's perspective as they're doing that. They're surrendering themselves to the divine order of the cosmos and depending on the divinity of the charity of other individuals to care for them. And again, with nirvana, they're seeking after infinite peace. Well, just because maybe they don't know the name and the face of the Prince of Peace, when they see his name and face, it's not like they're going to be pissed off. They're going to be like, here it is. Here's what I've been looking for. So, we get messed up because we interact mostly with Western quasi-Buddhists who have silly ideas and paint Buddhism as this, world, basically a Gnosticism. They recast it as a type of Gnosticism. But most of that's just kind of bogus, and they've taken the parts that they like from it and just plugged it into their own nihilism or Gnosticism and used it to reinforce that. So I don't think Buddhism is Christianity in secret or anything like that, but I think that it's going after truth. It's interested in moral activity of humans and cultivating that. It encourages people to meditate and to withdraw unhealthy significance from the attachments of the world, many of which are negative. And it encourages them to search for the infinite, eternal, abiding reality. I mean, that's what the dissatisfaction with the world comes from. And the intuitive sense that Buddhism is playing on is that missing, unsatisfied emptiness that we feel intuitively that we have, that we're based in, that we have some form of eternality at the core of us. And the Buddhism says, okay, go find that. And you won't find it in anything of the created order. And I think that all lines up perfectly well with Christianity. So I quote a good amount in this chapter and somewhat throughout the book from another particular book by a Buddhist monk. It's called Don't Be a Jerk. And I think if you read that book, if you're Christian and you're somewhat open to comparative religion stuff, that book just knocks it out of the park. I don't think he's intending to do it, but it's like very, like really close to like, this is a Christian view of the world. And that's actually, so it's Don't Be a Jerk. And this guy is translating the teachings of a Zen master named Dogen, who lived in Japan in, I think, the 13th century. So it's super interesting for someone who might be interested in that sort of comparison. I think if you read that book, that's a really good thrust in that direction.